I was sold on a Tuesday, not with chains, not with papers that said property, but with a handshake between my father and a man I had never met, over a debt I never created, for a future I never agreed to. I stood in a white dress that wasn't my style, in a hall full of people who weren't my friends, marrying a man who didn't look at me once during the entire ceremony, and my own mother whispered in my ear just before I walked down that aisle, "Don't embarrass us." That was my wedding day, and somehow that was also the first day of the greatest story of my life. If you've ever been treated like you were less than you were worth by the people who were supposed to love you the most, then stay right here, because this story was made for you. I'm going to tell you everything: the humiliation, the silence, the unexpected turns, and the moment I stopped being someone's solution and became my own answer. If this story moves you, if it makes you feel seen, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. I read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning. I grew up in a house that looked perfectly fine from the outside. We had a decent home, a neighborhood where people waved at each other, a father who wore iron shirts to work. But inside that house, everything was performance. Every dinner, every conversation, every decision, it was all about how things looked, not how they felt. Never how they felt. I was the second daughter, which in my family meant I was the backup plan. My older sister Lena was the golden one, the pretty one, the one my parents bragged about at every family gathering. I was just there. I got good grades and nobody celebrated. I had dreams of studying fine arts, and my father laughed, actually laughed, and said, "That's not a real future. Stop being dramatic." So I buried it. I buried the paintbrushes, the sketchbooks, the part of me that felt most alive, and I just tried to be useful. That was all I wanted, to be seen as useful, if not loved. Then the money ran out. I didn't know the full story until much later, but what I pieced together was this. My father had made a series of bad investments over 3 years, business decisions that crumbled one after another. He had borrowed money, quietly, from people who expected it back. And when it all collapsed, the debt was bigger than anything our family could cover. That's when Nathaniel's family came into the picture. His father and my father had crossed paths years before through a mutual business connection, old money meeting desperate money, and somewhere in those conversations between the tea and the pretending everything was fine, my father offered the only currency he thought he had left: me. I found out about the arrangement on a Wednesday afternoon. My mother sat me down in the kitchen, folded her hands on the table like she was about to deliver perfectly reasonable news, and told me I was going to be married to Nathaniel Ashford, 31 years old, heir to one of the largest private real estate and hospitality empires in the country. I remember staring at her and waiting for her to say she was joking. She didn't. I cried, I begged, I told them I had my own life, my own plans, that this wasn't the century for arranged marriages, that they couldn't do this. My father looked at me with this exhausted expression, not ashamed, just tired, and said, "You've never had to carry this family. This is your time to contribute." Contribute, like I was a financial instrument, like my entire existence had been building toward this moment of usefulness to him. Lena didn't say a word. She sat at the corner of the room during that conversation and looked at her phone. Later, in private, she told me I should be grateful, that Nathaniel was rich and handsome, and that I was honestly lucky someone of his caliber would agree to this. She said it with a smile. I've never forgotten that smile. The wedding was 3 weeks later. There was no engagement party, no dress shopping with my mother, no excited phone calls to friends. There was a dress chosen by Nathaniel's mother, a venue chosen by Nathaniel's family, and a guest list that was mostly strangers to me. I had maybe 7 people there who I actually knew. I met Nathaniel properly for the first time 4 days before the wedding, over a formal dinner arranged by both families. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and completely unreadable. He shook my hand, he asked me 2 polite questions, he smiled exactly once, a practiced, performative smile, and spent the rest of the dinner talking to my father about property markets. He didn't love me. He didn't even see me. And walking down that aisle, I understood something with devastating clarity. I was not a bride. I was a transaction, a living, breathing line item in a financial agreement between 2 men who had decided my life for me. When the ceremony ended, my mother fixed my hair one last time and said, "Make sure you make him happy." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "We love you." Just, "Make him happy." I got into that car and I left everything I had ever known, and I did not let myself cry until we were on the highway and I was sure no one could see me. The Ashford estate was extraordinary. I don't say that with warmth. I say it the way you'd describe a museum. Grand, beautiful, and completely cold. There were staff members who greeted me by name because they had been briefed. There were rooms I wasn't sure I was allowed in. There were flowers arranged every Monday because that was simply what was done here, not because anyone particularly loved flowers. Nathaniel and I barely spoke those first weeks. He left early, he came back late. We had dinner together maybe twice in the first month, and both times the conversation was polite in the way that strangers on a long flight are polite. Careful, surface level, going absolutely nowhere. I had no job. I had no friends nearby. I had no purpose inside those walls except to exist as Mrs. Ashford, which so far seemed to require very little of me. And my family? They called, but not to ask how I was adjusting, not to see if I was lonely or scared or struggling. They called to ask if Nathaniel could help with this, or if I could mention that, or if there was any chance I could speak to him about my father's lingering debts. Every single call had an agenda underneath it. Every single one. I stopped answering as much. The person who made those early months feel most unbearable wasn't Nathaniel, it was his younger sister, Vivian. Vivian was the kind of woman who weaponized elegance. She never raised her voice, she never said anything that could be directly quoted as cruel, but she had this talent for making you feel microscopic. She would comment on what I wore with a kind of concern that was pure condescension. She would reference inside jokes from their family history in front of me and then say, "Oh, you wouldn't know this." She made it quietly, persistently clear that I was an outsider and that she intended to keep me that way. There was one afternoon, about 6 weeks in, when everything inside me just broke open. I had wandered into a part of the East Wing I hadn't fully explored yet and found a room that had been used as an art studio at some point. Old canvases stacked against the wall, dried brushes in a jar, the smell of linseed oil still faintly in the air. I sat down on the dusty floor of that room and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the wedding. Not quiet crying, real crying, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep you can't even name the feeling. I didn't hear Nathaniel come in. I don't know how long he stood there before I noticed him, but when I looked up, something moved across his face. Not pity, not discomfort, something else. Something almost like recognition. He didn't say anything immediately. He just sat down, in his perfectly tailored suit, against the wall across from me, and after a long silence, he said, "This was my mother's room." That was the first real thing he had ever said to me. I didn't know what to do with it, but it stayed with me. Something had shifted, just slightly, the way a door moves when the air pressure changes. Not open, not closed, just no longer sealed. I started spending time in that studio, first just sitting, then cleaning it up. Then one afternoon, I picked up a brush, and something I had buried for years came flooding back with such force it almost knocked me over. I painted for 4 hours straight and didn't notice until the light had changed completely. I wasn't happy, but for the first time since the wedding, I was present. And my family continued to call. The calls were always the same, wrapped in a thin layer of "how are you" before getting to the real point. Lena called to tell me that Nathaniel should really consider investing in a venture her boyfriend was starting. My mother called to ask if we could cover my cousin's school fees. My father called to tell me he was proud of me, but only after a preamble that ended with a request. I started to understand something then. They had never treated me as a daughter. They had treated me as a resource, and now that the resource had been upgraded, they were simply making withdrawals from a better account. That understanding didn't make me angry yet. It just made me sad in a very quiet, settling way. The way you feel when you realize something has been true for a long time and you simply refuse to see it. About 3 months into the marriage, Nathaniel asked me something unexpected. He had a major charity gala coming, the kind of event his family hosted annually, attended by donors, partners, press. His usual coordinator had fallen through. He looked at me across the breakfast table one morning and said, almost casually, "You have a good eye. Would you want to take this on?" I almost said no. The old version of me, the one who had been told her instincts weren't valuable, almost deflected immediately. But something made me pause, and then I said yes. What happened over the next 3 weeks surprised everyone, including me. I threw myself into it completely. The vision I had for that event, the aesthetic, the flow, the details nobody else had thought to consider, came from somewhere I didn't know was still alive in me. I sourced local artists to display their work. I redesigned the seating arrangements so that conversations would actually happen. I created an experience rather than just an event. The night of the gala, I watched people walk in and visibly respond to the atmosphere. I watched Nathaniel's business partners pull him aside to ask who had put it together. I watched him point across the room at me, and the expression on his face was not what I had expected. It was respect. Vivian, predictably, had tried to interfere. She had gone behind my back to the catering company and attempted to override 2 of my key decisions, telling them Nathaniel had changed his mind. But Mrs. Harlow, the head housekeeper, a quiet and deeply loyal woman who had been with the estate for over a decade, had tipped me off the day before. I handled it calmly, directly, and without drama. And when Nathaniel found out what Vivian had done, he addressed it privately but unmistakably. She never tried that again. After the gala, things between Nathaniel and me changed with a kind of gentle momentum. We started having real conversations, not polite ones. I found out that his father had pressured him into the arrangement too, framing it as a strategic alliance, making it clear that Nathaniel's inheritance and position in the family were tied to his compliance. He was not the cold, indifferent man I had assumed. He was someone who had been making calculated survival decisions for years, the same as me from a completely different angle. We were 2 people who had been pushed into a room together and told to make the best of it, and slowly, carefully, we had started to make something real. I had also kept painting, and one evening Nathaniel brought a guest home, a longtime friend who ran a prominent gallery network. This man walked through the East Wing, saw the canvases I had been working on, and stood in front of one piece for a very long time without speaking. Then he turned around and asked when my first show would be. I genuinely did not know how to answer that, but Nathaniel, standing slightly behind him, caught my eye and gave the smallest nod I had ever seen. It meant, "Say yes." So I did. The gallery show was 6 months later. I can't fully describe what it felt like to stand in a room where people were responding to something that had come completely from inside me. The work was personal, painfully so. Some of the pieces were about loneliness, some were about silence, some were about the strange experience of being placed in a life that wasn't yours and slowly, unexpectedly making it yours anyway. Critics wrote about it, a magazine featured it. My name, not Nathaniel's name, not Mrs. Ashford, my name was the one in print. And then my family found out. The calls changed. My father called to tell me he had always believed in my talent. I held the phone and said nothing for a long moment because I was remembering very clearly the afternoon he had laughed at me for wanting to study art. My mother sent a long message about how proud she was and how she had always known I was special. Lena, who had told me I was lucky someone would take me, left a voice message using the word inspiring. Inspiring. And then, one afternoon, there was a car in the driveway of the estate, and when I walked to the front of the house, my sister was standing there, not calling from a distance, not texting, standing there in person with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She was struggling. Her relationship had ended badly. The venture she had pushed me to fund through Nathaniel had failed. She had nowhere to go and no one else to turn to, and she had come to me. I stood on those front steps and looked at the person who had sat quietly in the corner while I begged my parents not to send me away, who had told me I should be grateful to be used as collateral, who had never once called to ask if I was okay. I felt a lot of things standing there. I won't pretend I only felt grace. There was anger, there was grief, the grief of what a sister relationship could have been and never was. There was this aching awareness of the years I had spent trying to earn love from people who had always treated it as something I needed to deserve first. But I had changed. The woman standing on those steps was not the woman who had climbed into a car on her wedding day and cried alone on the highway. That woman had rebuilt herself from the inside, had found her voice, her talent, her partner, her dignity. And you can't truly become that person and still carry hatred. They don't live in the same body. So I made a decision, not out of weakness, not because I was desperate for her approval, but because I had the power now to choose who I wanted to be. I let her in. Not without a conversation, not without honesty. I told her exactly how I had felt. I said the words out loud that I had never been allowed to say. I told her that what the family had done to me was not something I would pretend was acceptable, that I would never allow myself to be treated that way again, that this, whatever came next, would be on completely different terms. She listened. For the first time in our lives, she actually listened. I used to think that winning meant watching the people who hurt you suffer. I understand now that the real win looks nothing like that. The real win is when you are so whole, so settled in who you are and what you have built, that their suffering simply doesn't complete you. You don't need it, because you're already full. Nathaniel and I, what we have now is something neither of us expected and both of us chose. It wasn't handed to us. It wasn't easy. It was built slowly, honestly, through two people deciding to see each other as full human beings in spite of everything that had pushed them together for the wrong reasons. I love him, not because he is wealthy, not because of the estate or the name or the life. I love him because he sat down on a dusty floor in a suit and said something true. Because when he saw who I really was, he didn't look away. My family is in my life, but differently now. I set the terms. I define the boundaries. The relationship with my parents is civil, sometimes even warm, but I never forgot what was said to me, and I never pretended it wasn't said. Forgiveness, I learned, is something you do for yourself. It's not a pardon. It's not an erasure. It's just the decision to stop letting someone else's choices poison your present. And Lena, We are learning each other slowly, like two strangers who share a history. Some days it's easier than others, but for the first time, it is honest. And I'll take honesty over performance every single time. There is something I want you to take from this story, something I wish someone had said to me on that Wednesday afternoon in the kitchen when my mother folded her hands and told me my life had been decided.
The people who underestimate you are not seeing reality. They are seeing their own limits. When they handed me over like a settlement, they thought they were removing me from the story. They didn't know they were sending me to the exact place where I would finally become myself. The cage was real. The pain was real. The loneliness was real. But so was every single thing that grew inside me because of it. And nothing, not their doubt, not their silence, not their sudden pride when I was no longer convenient to ignore, nothing can take that away. They tried to close a door on me. I walked through and found a whole world on the other side. That is what I want you to remember. Whatever room someone has locked you in, you are not stuck. You are being prepared. That's my story. Every word of it. The hurt, the silence, the turning points, the moments I almost gave up and the moments I didn't. If any part of this reached you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have been your foundation, I want you to know you are not alone. And I promise you, the story doesn't end in that kitchen. It doesn't end at the altar. It doesn't end where they tried to end it. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe, because I have more stories coming that will hit just as hard, and some that will hit even harder. Drop a comment below and tell me the moment in this story that hit closest to home. I will be reading. And the next story? Let's just say it involves a woman who was told she was replaceable and ended up being the one holding all the cards. Stay with me. You don't want to miss what's coming.